Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Rabble of Dead Money, The Great Crash and the Global Depression, 1929 to 1939, by Charles R. Morris, read by Tom Perkins. I was lucky enough to see with my own eyes the recent stock market crash, where they lost several $1 million, a rabble of dead money that went sliding off into the sea. Federico Garcia Lorca. Foreword. The Great Depression is an evergreen topic, and it's gotten a particular boost from the events of the Great Recession. If nothing else, the disdain that practitioners of modern economic management often exhibit for the officialdom of the 1930s may now be leavened with some empathy. Noting all exceptions, and there weren't many, the best people in the world of finance and economics were blindsided by the recession, and the recovery has been long and frustrating. The lessons of the Depression did serve modern policymakers well, however, in designing remediations. Flooding the world with new liquidity would have been anathema to the managers of the 1930s. I understand the Great Depression as a world phenomenon with roots in World War I and its sequelae. The United States enjoyed the most successful economy, but signs of overheating were rife. By the time of the stock market crash, it was due for a major, possibly a nasty, correction. But it was the global crash that turned an American correction into a Great Depression. My perspective throughout the book is an American one, filtering the international events through American eyes while keeping the important European events always in sight. Part 1 is devoted to a description of American daily living in the 1920s. Radical changes were afoot in every aspect of life, many of them driven by new technology, especially the automobile and AC electricity. It was both a heady and a frightening time, with population migrations from south to north and from rural areas to cities. There were deep changes in the workplace and in relations between men and women. Electricity-enabled mass communications created flash crowd mass events long before the Internet. Part 2 lays out the industrial structure of America and details its underlying economic performance. The 1920s was a time when employers first grappled with the implications of mass production and their relations with employees, and there were the first fumbling attempts by big business to sort out its relations with government. The remarkable boom in financial markets unbalanced ethical compasses and set the sector up for a fall. Part 3 concentrates on the crash in America. It happened in the first year of the presidency of the supremely gifted Herbert Hoover, a man who had never failed at anything. I examine the astonishing speed of the downturn, the impact on common people, the minimal attempts at remediation, and the consequences of the collapse. 2 concluding sections chart the ruin of Samuel Insull and Ivar Kruger. Part 4 takes a global perspective. It sketches a history of the gold standard and the monetary Pax Britannica that kept it on keel for so long. The central issue was how to reconstruct the international trading system amid the poisonous atmosphere of mistrust and dishonesty that was the heritage of the war and the Treaty of Versailles. The major powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, each had quite different views on issues of war debts and reparations, on reconstructing the gold standard, and on the desirability of inflation or deflation. Part 5 returns to America and analyzes the initial recovery under Roosevelt, the 1937 downturn, and the subsequent recovery. I review a large swath of the current scholarship on the New Deal to appraise where it helped and where it got in the way. I also show that it wasn't World War II that ended the Depression, for it was already over before the war started. The book ends with Part 6, a compact analysis of the underlying forces that brought on the World Depression and the important micro-developments that gave the American experience its own exceptional flavor. Prelude. Kaiser Wilhelm II, King of Prussia and Emperor of Germany, was jubilant. It was the 35th day after the mobilization, and the German army was approaching Paris in three great arrays, with salients already as close as 30 miles from the city. The Kaiser's troops had traveled hundreds of miles, mostly on foot, moving the lines forward by almost 6 miles a day against the flower of the French army. Within a week, they were expected to have overwhelmed Paris and forced its surrender, bringing the war to a glorious close. The Kaiser was especially delighted because his army's positioning was almost precisely in accord with the Schlieffen Plan, the brainchild of Alfred von Schlieffen, the head of the German Imperial General Staff from 1890 to 1906. Schlieffen had calculated that on or about the 40th day after the invasion of Belgium, France's ally Russia would have completed its mobilization and begun to attack in the east. With Paris fallen, Russia would likely withdraw rather than fight alone against the full power of the German war machine, which could be rapidly deployed to the east by railroad. In 1914, war planning was the prerogative of General Helmut von Moltke, the younger, the nephew of the great Helmut von Moltke the elder, who had masterminded the lightning 6-week victory in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, and preceded Schlieffen as chief of the General Staff. The elder Moltke believed that his stunning 1871 victory was not repeatable, in great part because the French had built such a strong system of fortresses from Verdun, just below the border with Belgium, south to Belfort, just above the northern border of Switzerland, effectively covering the approaches to France from German territory. Moltke was also one of the very few European commanders who had studied the American Civil War and understood how easily two armies with vast numbers of well-equipped troops might fall into a prolonged stalemate. Schlieffen was a brilliant tactician, but had a highly abstract conception of strategy, disdain for naval operations, and little feel for politics or the tug of nationalisms. He agreed with Moltke on the difficulties of attacking the formidable networks of French forts, and without apologies or compunction, developed a plan that depended on invading neutral Holland and Belgium to skirt the French defenses. German statesmen and generals, from the Kaiser on down, seem to have readily adopted the plan, while piously swearing that they never would invade a neutral country unless their enemy had already invaded it. But their behavior betrayed their intentions, for the National Railroad, which was essentially an arm of the military, was steadily reconfigured to support a massive movement of men and materiel to the Belgian and Dutch borders. As Winston Churchill pointed out in 1911, the great military camps in close proximity to the frontier, the enormous depots, the reticulation of railways, the endless sidings, revealed with the utmost clearness and beyond all doubt the German design. The Schlieffen Plan went through many iterations. The final version, the famous 1905 Memorandum, assumed that practically all the German striking power would be in the right wing. It would comprise 35 corps, about 1 million men, and would strike France from the north through Amiens to Paris. The plan was for an essentially one-front war, save for a covering force of 5 corps to protect the coal-rich Alsace-Lorraine region that the Germans had taken from France in 1871. Schlieffen paid no attention to the possibility that Great Britain might be compelled to join France in the face of brutal attacks on neutral countries, perhaps a symptom of his tin ear for politics. He also paid no attention to the Eastern Front, which was reasonable enough in 1905, given the string of Russian fiascos in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. Ignoring Russia was not possible in 1914, however, since the Tsar, with the help of France, had been diligently strengthening his military and had achieved several years of respectable industrial growth, although from a very low base. The military historian John Keegan has criticized the Schlieffen Plan for its rigidity and for its impracticality. Even in 1914, the German military did not dispose of the manpower that the plan required. Schlieffen himself had expressed his doubts on the adequacy of the attacking force. The marching times required for the extreme German right wing may have been impossible, and the timing of the attack took no account of the likely destruction of French bridges and rail lines. Schlieffen had insisted on an additional 8 corps for the right wing, about 200,000 men, but while they could be accommodated by the railroads to the German borders, transportation would probably fail once they crossed into the neutral countries. Schlieffen and his successor as chief, the younger Moltke, ignored those constraints. As Keegan put it, the extra 200,000 troops simply appear outside Paris, an example of the wishful thinking that he finds throughout the plan. The younger Moltke was not of the same fiber as his uncle. He was a fine staff officer, but openly admitted that he might not be up to the job of chief of staff. "I lack the power of rapid decision," he said. "I am too reflective, too scrupulous, or if you like, too conscientious for such a post. I lack the capacity for risking all on a single throw." He has been savagely criticized for his departures from the master plan, and the fairness of such criticisms is still debated today. One distinguished scholar, for example, heaps blame on Moltke, claiming that his change in the Schlieffen plan had disastrous effects on the German prospects of victory in 1914 and effectively nullified his chances of victory, while the military expert Little Hart commented that Schlieffen's formula for a quick victory amounted to little more than a gambler's belief in the virtuosity of sheer audacity. The spark that set off the war was the June 28th assassination of the Grand Duke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and his wife, in Sarajevo. The Balkans were seething with independence and pro-Slavic movements, often with the covert assistance of Russia, seeking to advance its vision of a great Slavic empire at the expense of Austria-Hungary's Habsburgs. In response to the assassination, Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, backed by a German note to other great powers. Serbia promptly mobilized, but much of this was posturing. In previous Balkan flare-ups, hostilities had been deflected by the intervention of the big powers. On cue, the British proposed an international conference. The French and Italian governments eagerly accepted the invitation, setting the stage for the time-honored face-saving adjustments that could usually keep an inherently unstable situation tottering along for another few years. Austria, almost inadvertently it seems, refused to play by the script and mobilized against Serbia. Russia's Tsar Nicholas, after hesitating a day, responded with a general mobilization, implicitly including Germany. The German government requested that Great Britain declare its neutrality, which they refused on July 30th. On August 1st, Germany mobilized, declared war on Russia, and demanded right of passage through Belgium. Over the next few days, Germany declared war on France and Belgium, and Great Britain declared war on Germany, cementing the alliance of France, Russia, and Great Britain against the Central Powers led by Germany. The first elements of the German army crossed the Belgian border on August 4th. All of these events transpired in an atmosphere of distrust, prevarication, hysteria, indecision, misunderstanding, and intentional misdirection. John Maynard Keynes famously wrote, "What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was which came to an end in August 1914. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could secure forthwith, if he wished it, cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or other formality. He could then proceed abroad to foreign quarters, without knowledge of their religion, language, or customs, bearing coined wealth upon his person, and would consider himself greatly aggrieved and much surprised at the least interference. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent. The projects and politics of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play the serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of social and economic life. Keynes was eulogizing the high culture of Europe, its common heritage of Greek philosophy and Roman jurisprudence, the shared literature of Shakespeare, Molière, Schiller, and Lessing, Tolstoy and Pushkin, the music of Mozart, Beethoven, and Verdi. Reminders of the ancientness of the common culture were everywhere, in the great cathedrals and castles, and in the universities. Although most countries still had kings and queens, they usually ruled in accommodation with somewhat representative parliaments, amid slow but steady expansion of the franchise. There was an inchoate but growing attention to social insurance, the legacy of Germany's great chancellor Otto von Bismarck. A glittering international cafe society dazzled with its wit, its taste, its curiosity. But those splendid vistas were constantly shadowed by the black specter of war. It was not an alien presence, but part of the same cultural inheritance. States maintained armies, polished battle plans, and declared wars. Wars were an essential element in maintaining a polity's health and ensuring its progress. In his famous 1910 anti-war book, The Great Illusion, Norman Angell collected a sample of journalistic arguments for the obvious necessity for wars. From the National Review: without a powerful fleet, a perfect organization behind the fleet, and an army of defense, all security will disappear, and British commerce and industry must rapidly decline, thus accentuating British national degeneracy and decadence. From the Fortnightly Review: does any man who understands the subject think there is any power in the world that can prevent Germany from now closing with Great Britain for her ultimate share of overseas trade? This is behind all the colossal armaments that indicate the present preparations for a new struggle for sea power. From the London World: Great Britain exists by virtue of her foreign trade and her control of the carrying trade of the world. Defeat in war would mean the transference of both to other hands, and consequent starvation for a large % of wage earners. And from Blackwood's magazine: we appear to have forgotten the fundamental truth that the warlike races inherit the earth, and that nature decrees the survival of the fittest. Our parrot-like repetition that the greatest of all British interests is peace must inevitably give to any people who covet our wealth and our possessions the ambition to strike a swift and deadly blow at the heart of the empire, undefended London. Germany had its own fears. The banker Max Warburg reported on an unsettling conversation with the Kaiser in June 1914. He was worried about the Russian armaments, program, and about the planned railway construction, and detected in these the preparations for war against us in 1916. He complained about the inadequacy of the railway links that we had at the Western Front against France, and hinted whether it should not be better to strike now rather than wait. Warburg decidedly advised against this, citing British domestic politics, French military and financial problems, and the backwardness of the Russian military. He advised the Kaiser to wait patiently, keeping our heads down for a few more years. We are growing stronger every year, our enemies are getting weaker internally. The General Staff, however, fed the Kaiser's paranoia, and they had reasons for their discomfort. Germany was far from the most militarized nation in Europe. France took those honors, for a full 83% of its military-aged males had undergone serious military training, compared to 53% in Germany. Germany's peacetime army was maintained at 761,000 men, compared to 827,000 in France and 1,445,000 in Russia. In wartime, the French-Russian-German-Austrian ratio became 5,200,000 to 3,485,000. Besides its huge population advantage, Russia was engaged in a surprisingly fast modernization program, much of it driven by the private sector, and focused on railroads, electricity, and heavy industry. Germany also recently had been forced into a humiliating climb-down in a contest of dreadnought battleship building with Great Britain. Much to the German generals' chagrin, they had little success in pressing their views on the government. When they pleaded for expanded capabilities, the civilian war minister scoffed that the entire structure of the army, instructors, barracks, etc., could not digest more recruits, and blamed the constant badgering for more forces on the agitation of the Army League and the Pan-Germans. There was even subtle opposition to military expansion within the senior officers. The top echelons of the military were dominated by Prussian aristocrats, who were concerned about the dilution of quality that would follow upon an increasingly technocratic rather than aristocratic officer corps. The pattern of European military spending supported the German general's case. Of the most likely combatants in a European war, the Germans, with their Austrian allies, were spending just over 60% of the total of Great Britain, France, and Russia. But much of that can be discounted. A war in Europe was likely to be primarily a ground war, with naval power largely used to blockade supplies. The British held a clear dominance of sea power, but were still debating whether and how much to build up their infantry when the war broke out. Russia had been arming prodigiously, but the quality of its military officers, its impoverished and torpid peasantry, and the deficiencies of its infrastructure greatly limited its effectiveness. The historian Paul Kennedy points out that, of all the European countries, Germany had much the best balance of economic and military power. Due to its rapid industrial growth, it could bear its growing military burdens with less strain than virtually every other combatant, and had enormous staying power. Its populace may have been the best educated in Europe, its industrial production was greater than Britain's, its steel production was greater than the British, French, and Russian combined, and it was a world leader in advanced industries like chemicals, machine tools, communications, and optics. German military capabilities reflected all those advantages. It was the only major power to have adjusted its military strategies to comport with the leaps in weapon technologies. Traditional land warfare was mostly a matter of men with rifles standing in a line and shooting at each other. The German military had evolved a strategy of defense in depth, with a zone of continuous defense with scattered small group outposts and machine gun nests firing at the attacker's flanks. The same concepts, or storm troop tactics, applied to the offense, emphasizing rapid movement and rapid fire by small detachments with considerable independence. Other advances included trenching technology and synchronization of infantry and artillery practice, like the creeping bombardment, all of it backed up by careful analysis and institutionalization of proven innovations. The German tactical edge was evident in their remarkable success in killing their opponents. Over the course of the war, 5.4 million combatants on the Allied side lost their lives, with the great majority killed by the enemy, while the Central Powers, Germany and Austria, lost 4 million, for a 35% net body count advantage. British statisticians had even higher figures, showing a 50% advantage for the Germans, although some of that difference doubtless stemmed from the Allies' penchant for mass attacks. One day's battle at the Somme River, a British assault under Field Marshal Douglas Haig, cost the British 60,000 casualties, against 8,000 for the Germans. When the German armies came pouring across the Belgian border, they met a populace ready to fight. The system of forts at Liège and Namur guarding the Meuse River crossings were formidable obstacles. The Liège system was 25 miles in circumference, with most of the buildings underground, disposing of 12 equally spaced forts with 400 heavy guns, with the whole protected by a 30-foot deep moat. It took about a week for the Germans to destroy the Liège forts, and another 2 weeks to level Namur. The decisive weapons were 4 massive new artillery pieces, 2 from Krupp and 2 from the Austrian Skoda, each more powerful than those on dreadnought-class battleships. Once they had secured their passage, the Germans descended on the civilian population with vindictive fury. more than 1,000 Belgian civilians were systematically massacred. The nadir of their revenge came on August 25th, when the Germans torched the leafy university town of Louvain, the Oxford of Belgium, and its priceless trove of ancient manuscripts. The French had a war strategy of their own. General Joseph Joffre positioned the bulk of his armies in northeast France with access to Belgium and to Alsace-Lorraine, the sacred territory transferred to Germany after the 1870-1871 Franco-Prussian War. In effect, Joffre hoped to exploit the German focus on Belgium by unleashing a major attack to push them out of Alsace. It was badly misconceived. Alsace was well defended, and the Germans had by far the greater grasp of field tactics. At the first French attacks, the Germans retreated, sucking the French farther away from their support, and then fell on them. The French held several towns, then lost them, then held and lost them again. By the last week in August 1914, the French were essentially fighting desperate holding actions all along their lines in a wide outward-facing semicircle that was centered on Paris. Its perimeter originally stretched from the Channel ports along the Belgian and Luxembourg borders down to the western edges of the French Ardennes, but the whole space was rapidly imploding in the direction of Paris. By this time, a modest British Expeditionary Force, BEF, comprising 1 cavalry and 4 army divisions, had been landed on the Channel ports to bolster the beleaguered French and Belgians. The BEF was immediately confronted by a powerful German army near the Belgian town of Mons. Although they gave a good account of themselves as steady fighters and marksmen, they were greatly outnumbered by the Germans, and they escaped only with heavy casualties. In the first 2 months of the war, the French suffered 329,000 killed in battle, a toll that rose to 500,000 by the end of 1914. In the crisis, Joffre proved his mettle. He forthrightly recognized his own mistakes, fired dozens of non-performing generals, and promoted younger high flyers, including Ferdinand Foch, an aggressive and creative battle manager. Strategically, Joffre went into full retreat mode with marching men carrying 60-pound packs and covering as much as 16 to 20 miles a day. Impressively, Joffre reconstituted the remnants of 2 nearly decimated armies into a new force and organized the defense of Paris around the rivers of the Seine, the Marne, and the Ourcq on the north and eastern side. Almost in parallel, Moltke's weaknesses as a field commander began to be exposed. The pursuing German soldiers were energized by the prospect of a stunning victory, but they were as physically exhausted as their opponents. As their supply lines lengthened, their fighting ranks dwindled as they were redeployed in securing their rear, pacifying the civilian populations, and managing prisoners. It was at that point, in the midst of the drive toward Paris, that Moltke, feeling victory was assured, detached 2 corps, at full strength about 70,000 men, for service in the east against Russia. This was not necessarily a violation of the Schlieffen Plan, as many commentators have had it, for Russia had mobilized with surprising speed. 2 separate massive armies entered East Prussia on August 15th and August 22nd, well ahead even of the French concentration of forces in the west. Worse, the Germans got badly pounded in an early artillery battle, and the commander in the east was showing signs of panicking. But a more confident commander than Moltke might have recognized the folly of endangering the essential goal of a quick victory in France for the sake of a minor reverse in a fringe area. Moltke had also never been known for his skill in large-scale force management, and he clearly muffed the management of his forces closing on Paris around the Marne River. He failed to intervene in a dispute between 2 commanders, Karl von Bülow and Alexander von Kluck, that resulted in a glaring 30-mile gap between their forces. Even worse, Moltke and his staff seem to have been unaware of Joffre's repositioning of his forces. When Kluck was finally ordered to take his proper position, which would have closed the gap, he unwittingly exposed his flank on the Paris side to a large French army which attacked vigorously. Kluck escaped, but it was a near thing. Bülow then maneuvered to help Kluck and came under attack by another repositioned French force, which widened the German gap to 40 miles.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?